The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again. Another episode of Genesis is coming up for you folks. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz. And today, folks, we are going to be having my last show of the season. As I've been mentioning in my previous shows, jury duty's calling me, and in Massachusetts, for some stupid reason, lawyers, judges, they all get called to do jury duty, and I know I'm going to have to serve. And I got to appear before the Taunton Court here in the Fall River part of Massachusetts Monday morning. And Genesis will be taking a hiatus for the holiday break, and I'll be resuming in January again after the New Year's and when my twin boys go back to school after the Christmas and New Year's vacation. But today we have a great show coming up for you. Mike Cameron, who had written a book many years ago, and unfortunately Mike had passed away a few years ago, he wrote a book on Fred Merkle, and now most of us know that he, Bonehead Merkle, and we're going to get into all that today. But Public Bonehead, Private Hero, The Real Legacy of Baseball's Fred Merkle was a great book published back in 2010. We got JD Thorn, who is a lawyer from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He's going to be on the show to talk about Merkle since he is very interested in Merkle. We're going to get JD on the show with his 10 Commandments of Baseball, in which he writes about, what went on in old baseball and how the logic was applied to great manager Joe McCarthy. But before we get to JD, before we get to Merkle, you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. And we have a lot of shows on. We have Golenbach University with Peter Golenbach. We got Vintage Sports with Hal Bach. We got Mark and Mark in the Midday with Mark Littell. Many people don't know Mark. He's the guy who served up the ball to Chris Chambliss in the 1976 American League Championship Series to send the Yankees to the World Series, Kansas City, and that's what happened in 76, and we are honored to have him on the show. We also have Bill Kashatis out in Philadelphia with Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, future. We got Wayne Unger, we got me, Alan Blumpkin, and renowned author Dave Nemec on Dave Nemec's Old-Time Baseball and Trivia. So there's a lot of shows. We got Alan Blumpkin and David Finoli on the Pittsburgh gang out there. They're doing Pittsburgh baseball. A lot of stuff's going on in the network. Winter meetings are coming this week. Going to be very exciting off season. My Yankees just got Aaron Boone as the manager. What was funny is I was texting his brother Brett Boone at the time, and I said, "You better go, Brett. Your brother was just made Yankees manager." And then for me to be associated with the Boone family, for as long as I have been, a few years, and to do this, it's really, really a treat to continue to see this family who has contributed to baseball since 1947, since Grandpa Ray got into the league, and to see his father when I was growing up, and then to see Brett and Aaron, and now that I talk to these folks, I'm even closer to baseball than I ever have been, and I'm very blessed by having shows like this and writing books on the subject, and getting to have these great authors on the show so that we can teach you, the listener at home, stuff you might not know. And Merkle is a very, very good thing that a lot of people don't know. We all know he made that, myth on September 23rd, 1908, but there's a lot more to the story on Fred Merkle, and we're going to get into it. JD Thorn, he's a lifelong baseball fan and former University of Wisconsin baseball player. He is a well-known employment law attorney. See, employment law, okay, unions. See, this is good stuff. I'm a tax lawyer. This is a well-known lawyer attorney who played more than 20 years of highly competitive amateur ball. He has been involved in many civic organizations, the latest being a group that is working to get men's reestablished at the University of Wisconsin, and that's Ben's Baseball. In addition to his most recent work, The 10 Commandments of Baseball, Thorn is the author of the classic management text, Concise Guide to Successful Employment Practices. All the big shots. You know, I get him on my show. JD, how you doing today?
Hey, it's terrific, Ian.
Oh, employment law, huh? This is great. You could have destroyed the reserve clause years ago.
Well, I once did a program in the 90s when they had the strike, and it was interesting to me for the State Bar of Wisconsin when our speaker all of a sudden canceled at the last minute and to talk about the strike because he was on the negotiating team as a member of Bud Selig's law firm. So he cancels at the last second, but I was ready to go.
Yeah,
so I told him all about it.
That's fantastic. Now let me ask you this: how did you get involved and interested in Fred Merkle, one of the biggest bluffs in baseball history? Happened in the dead ball era, my favorite era that I like to research. What interested you so much about Merkle?
Well, I put it in my book, The 10 Commandments of Baseball, as well, because the Merkle story was one that I knew. It involved the Chicago Cubs. I've been a lifelong Chicago Cubs fan, and comes to me honestly from my grandfathers and father. So Merkle was a very interesting story, and it's a very sad story. Happy for the Chicago fans because they won the 1908 pennant and World Series because of it. Without it, they wouldn't have been in the game. But it was sad for the way the New York sports writers portrayed Merkle as a bonehead. And that's one of the things of Mike Cameron's books that's so great is that he recognized that as a journalist. And Mike was a journalist in the Chicago suburbs, and he always felt that Merkle had been mistreated, as pretty much of us, baseball aficionados really knew at the time. Because, we'll go through what happened, and he was really unfairly blamed because he did something that every other player did at the same time and was brought up by enforcement of a technical rule of which he knew nothing about.
Let me ask you this. I know you're from Wisconsin. Now, Merkle was born in Watertown, Wisconsin. Let me ask you this. How is he viewed in Wisconsin these days?
Well, I would say most people don't remember him at all. The Watertown, Wisconsin, though, does have a memorial, bronze plaque up somewhere, and it's a very wonderful old river town in Wisconsin between Madison and Milwaukee. It's a beautiful, beautiful community.
And let me ask you this. Merkle was the youngest man ever at that time to be a pinch hitter. The guy was 18 years old. When he made his famous boner, he was 19 years old. How is his rise that meteoric during that time?
Well, I wouldn't. He was an outstanding athlete, and that's probably where it begins. So he ended up growing up in near Toledo, Ohio, and after graduating high school, he played on some amateur teams and then was immediately recognized as a tremendous talent. He was also a very bright fellow. His father had been a school teacher and had taken the job in Watertown, Wisconsin when Fred was born, and then later migrated to Ohio. But he was a very erudite musician, pianist, philosopher, and so Fred followed in those ways too. So, he spoke 2 languages. He studied philosophy. He was, which in those days you didn't necessarily have to go to college to do that. And he grew up as in a very serious household and took things seriously. So his integrity was 100%. And that's what meant everything to him. And then he was a tremendous athlete besides. He was about 6'1", 6'2". So in those days, that was large. 1908 we're talking about here. 1907 when he broke into the league. But I wouldn't say he really had a rise to stardom because the first year in the league he pinch hit, as you mentioned, the youngest pinch hitter at the time. He was brought up very early to be groomed by John McGraw and the New York Giants who saw talent in him. And but in the first year, in 1907, he appeared just periodically as a pinch hitter, learning from the rest of the players on the team. So then you get into 1908. Now the famous incident took place in September, towards the end of the season, with only actually about 3 weeks to go in the season. He then didn't play much either. In fact, I think he hadn't started a game for 47 games by the time the game with the incident came in. So he was really a rookie that saw sparse duty, but on the day of the game against the Cubs in September, the regular first baseman I think had headaches or something and couldn't play, so they put Merkle at first base, and that was sort of McGraw's plan, to have a backup first baseman. So we had Merkle was also, he didn't play that much in 1907. He was still considered a rookie. So we have a rookie taking the place of a veteran, and it didn't work out too well for him personally because he was blamed for the incident that took place, and very unfairly.
And you know what's interesting about here? You got to give a lot of credit to Johnny Evers because he read the Rule 59. And you know, on the Cubs, and you know where he read this rule? First of all, let's go into the rule itself. I'll let you do the honors, unless you want me to do the honors.
Sure. No. Let me talk about it. I in my book, the 10th commandment, or not the 10th commandment, but the 6th of the commandment is keep your head up, and you may not have to keep it down. And I interpret that two ways. One of which is keep your head up, don't get despondent, don't get discouraged, persevere, keep your head up. And then the other way is also, well, be alert. Be alert. See what's happening. And it not necessarily has to be something that's happening on the ball field. And in this particular case, Mike Cameron's research revealed that it appears that and I pronounce his name Evers, which I think is the more Irish pronunciation. And Johnny Evers, the second baseman for the Cubs, was one of the fiery leaders of the team. And the team itself, 1906 Cubs, set the record for highest winning percentage ever in a season. They won 116 games. Now, this was a powerhouse team. It wasn't just Tinkers, the shortstop, to Evers, the second baseman, to Chance, Frank Chance, big Frank Chance, the manager, first baseman. This team was loaded with talent and pitching talent too. So to think about a team, they were 116 and 38 in 1906. Now that's having a season, and nobody has ever had a higher winning percentage ever. 1907, guess what? They win the National League pennant and win the World Series too. Now, 1906, the ignominy of all Chicago Cub fans is that here they have the best team in 1906, and guess what? They lose the World Series to who? The Chicago White Sox. Oh, how terrible is that? The only time the two teams ever played in the big matchup. They hit the wonders of the Chicago White Sox. Their pitching overwhelmed the Cub hitting, and they won in 6 games. So then the Cubs in 1907 win the pennant again, and this time win the World Series. So now we're in 1908, and it was a hot playoff race for the pennant, chase for the pennant, with the Pittsburgh Pirates. You mentioned some of these cities in your introduction. So Honus Wagner and the Pittsburgh Pirates were among, with the New York Giants and the Chicago Cubs, favored to take the National League pennant again. And they had a horrid race all the way down to the end. So we're leading up to how did Johnny Evers find out about this? Well, the story that Mike Cameron reports in his book, Bonehead, Merkle, Private Hero, because he dealt with the allegations. Not only did Merkle deal with the allegations of misplay, his sons and even his grandsons did. The name stuck so hard, Bonehead Merkle, that it really followed down generations till the 1930s before it ended up reverberating into the eternity. Except for us baseball historians and people who'd like to talk about it. So Johnny Evers, Mike Cameron suspects, saw a newspaper article in the Chicago Tribune, and it was actually one of these columns. I think if you think about 1908, there might have been 10 or 11 papers published on a daily basis in Chicago and New York and the other big cities, all fighting for attention. So this particular paper, I think it was the Chicago American, had a fan write in, quiz the expert. And one of the fans wrote in and asked a very simple question, which was, what about Rule 59? Now, what's Rule 59? Rule 59, which is still the same today, and many baseball players and managers and fans will know this when I say it. It's that if you have a situation where a runner scores, but the out on the play is the third out of the inning, and it's a force out. In other words, it could be a ground ball to the shortstop with a runner on third, and the runner on third scampers home, and then the ball is thrown to the first baseman, and even if that runner scored before the out was made, the run still doesn't score if the out is a force out. Now, this also, and that was the question, what happens in this? Some fan must have seen it. And what happens with this? And then the answer was, no, the run doesn't score, Rule 59. It also applies if you have runners on first and second, and the force out is made. If you have runners on first and second, you can have a force out made at third. And again, if that runner, even if that runner scores across his home plate before that force out is made at third, it still doesn't count because the last out was a force out. It could be second base with a runner on first base. Now, as we go forward in time, what happens is actually what I think, not that Johnny Evers did not personally read the newspaper that had this little blip on it, but in my imagination, I know all players and entertainers and people, I'm sure, were giving the Beatles songs that they would like the Beatles to write, and you could say, you can call it Lennon and McCarthy, and I don't care. It's just a good tune, and see if you can do something with it. Or, so people in those days, too, would be telling the ball players. They're having a beer after the game, and somebody says, oh, did you see that article in the Chicago Tribune about Rule 59? And I thought that was an interesting question. So that's my guess, is that somebody tells Evers about it, and then he starts to think about it. And the custom of the day was, if you're on first base, for example, and there's a runner on third base, which is the actual situation that took place, the score is tied, it's the ninth inning, the home team is up at bat. Well, a base hit to the outfield brings in that runner from third. Game is over. It's a gentleman's game. There's no question that the winning run scored fairly and equitably, and so the game is over. And what would happen? And Mike Cameron beautifully points out that there were several other aspects of the game at that time. It's 1908. The spitball was a legal pitch and a very successful one. Those that threw it said it was easier to control than an actual fastball or curveball. Why that was, I'm not sure, but those that threw it, like Big Ed Walsh of the Chicago White Sox, said no, that was easier on his arm too. So those are the things that were around, but there was much less security at a ball game than we have today, and they didn't really think about it so much. The game grew so quickly and became so popular that it overwhelmed really the game itself. So the owners, to try and make more money, often put seats on the field in front of the walls, because, as you pointed out, it's a dead ball era. A lot of balls don't go over the fence. If anything, they maybe roll to the fence. And it was not uncommon where players, outfielders, if a ball rolled the fence, he'd be fighting with the fans to get the ball because they were on the field, drinking and eating and gambling and doing all the things that fans like to do. In fact, the ball players, Mike points out, were trained to be aware of bottles being thrown in their way. And then the fans also got on the umpires fiercely, just like the players did. So it was a very fan-friendly atmosphere, so much so that it was really out of control, although they didn't really know that. And they allowed it to happen. It was fun. It was a fun atmosphere. So Rule 59, Johnny Evers starts thinking about it, and in the Torrid pennant race, the Cubs were playing Honus Wagner and the Pirates in Pittsburgh. Now, I think this article appeared in about July of that year in the Chicago Tribune, and it didn't pop up again until sometime in August in this series with Pittsburgh. The umpire was the very famous, I want to say Hank O'Day, who had been a former player, very well-respected umpire, and he took his umpiring very seriously. This was his profession. He had been an umpire for several years. As an aside, one of the issues with the umpires is that for cost purposes, they usually only had one umpire in a game. And there was a big push on to have two umpires. So we think of what instant replay is today. It's a little different there. They didn't want to spend the money on a second umpire. And there was some controversy about that, and it actually came into play in what happened here. So the game is in Pittsburgh. Tie score 0-0, ninth inning. Pittsburgh's up at bat in the bottom of the ninth, and with a runner in scoring position, the player gets a base hit. Now, as was the custom of the day, very often the fans would storm the field after an exciting game, and it was absolute chaos. And the players would know this, so very often it was a race to the clubhouse to get away from the fans for the players. And in this game in Pittsburgh, there's only a single umpire, Hank O'Day, behind home plate. The base hit is hit. The apparent winning run, 0-0 game, would make it 1-0. Comes in from third base. The hitter doesn't go all the way to first base and veers off because he's gotten the base hit. He's done his job and races for the clubhouse to get away from the fans. Well, Johnny Evers had read this rule, and he went and got the ball and went over to first base and touched first base, and then looked at the umpire, Hank O'Day, and said, make the call. He didn't go all the way to first base. He's out. It's a force out. The run doesn't score. Let's keep playing. By this time, of course, the fans are all over the field, and Hank O'Day looks at it and says, I didn't see it, which he didn't. And if the umpire didn't see it, then he couldn't make a call. So he let the play stand, and Pittsburgh won the game. But afterwards, the umpires and the players travel together sometimes, and they talked after the games. The idea here is that Evers talked to the umpire and said, Hank, I understand you didn't see it, but let's pretend that this situation occurs again. which it very well may. What's the call? And Hank O'Day said, no, you're right. In theory, if it's a force out at first base, and it doesn't matter whether the runner crossed home plate before that force out was made, the run doesn't score. That's the rule. So there's no question about what the rule was, Rule 59. The why it was put in play, I've always often pondered, but I think it's to prevent false double plays, and it's sort of like the infield fly rule is. Be that as it may.
Well, you know what's interesting? That's the Warren Gill, what you were just saying with Pittsburgh, because if Merkle never did what he did in the next instance where Evers would test the waters, we'd be talking about Warren Gill today. It's Warren Bonehead Gill, like Cameron wrote.
Exactly.
Now the thing is this: is the rule still in effect today?
Yes, it is.
And so
117 years later.
And so you have to touch the base. You have to run it out. And even if the run scores and you hit that base hit, you still got to touch first base. Otherwise, you'll be called out.
Well, I would say that the team in the field has to initiate an appeal to the ump if he doesn't call it. But everybody runs him out today because of what happened in 1908 with Merkle. In fact, that's one of the 10 commandments of baseball. Run them all out. You can never tell. That's commandment number 7.
That's right.
And I think that's where I talk about it in my book. So I talked about the Merkle incident and run them all out. You never know. And, maybe we should, build ourselves up to really what happened in that game. I really enjoyed Mike Cameron's discussion a little bit about what was the world like in 1908.
Let's go into that. Let's go into the automobile and the airplane and everything else that's going on in society.
Teddy Roosevelt. Well, you'd had a period of peace there since the Spanish-American War, at least for the Americans. And Teddy Roosevelt had been the president after taking over because of the assassination of McKinley. And he was a terrific president, very robust, trust-busting, for the people, a populist, if you will, and very aggressive in his execution of being the chief executive. Times were good. The economy was exploding. The enthusiasm in the country was exploding. It was before the start of World War I, and although some of the seeds for that were being planted, but it was a time of peace, of pax, throughout the world as well as the country. It was a time of great invention. You talked about it. Henry Ford invented his Model T, and where there were other cars and so on, he said, this one is going to be black. It's very basic, but it'll get you from point A to point B, and he'll sell. And he sold it for 1/3 the price. Now you think about that. What if your iPhone was 1/3 of what? Wouldn't you buy that one as long as it worked just the same?
I got an LG telephone right here. I don't spend on the iPhone or anything.
Well, then you had the Wright brothers were following up the flight, and at this point in time, it was how long could you stay in the air, and they had set that year the flight record, I think for a 2.5 hour flight, which they did in France. The unfortunate part was the day before they set that record, they also tried to make a record, and one of the pilots fell off the plane to his death. So they were undeterred, and then the next day they set the new flight record, and so aviation was people thinking about its military applications, which is near and dear to Milwaukee. That was Our Billy Mitchell was in the forefront of that, and was even later on. He was so vocal about it that he was stripped of his military command. They didn't like hearing about it, but of course that was the truth. So when you come to Milwaukee, you fly into General Billy Mitchell Field. They made a movie about that at one time. So these were very interesting times. Wright brothers, Teddy Roosevelt, Model T Ford. It was all gangbusters, all go. And so people were very rabid about their baseball, too. And, in fact, when you think about baseball, well, what's the background there? Was there football, professional football? No. Was there professional basketball? No. The colleges were just starting to play. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt saved college football because it was so rough that they had a few deaths, and they put in new rules which allowed for the forward pass, and that made a whole difference in the game, and we didn't lose the game with college football. Very interesting times. If you went over to Spain, the great Spanish bullfighter Juan Belmonte was he was the Babe Ruth of bullfighting. He was on the stage. In fact, Babe Ruth was just starting to hit home runs at his orphanage, St. Mary's in Baltimore, and becoming the world's best player ever. I don't think his records can even be challenged at all for what he did and was able to do for many, many years. So 1908 was really something. So you think about all that, Melu, all of that pent up interest. By the time the Cubs, and sure enough, it's just as predicted, it's the Pirates and the Cubs and the New York Giants, managed by Pugsy McGraw, John McGraw, the great John McGraw, who managed them for 35 years, who came from the tradition of he was a player in the 1890s for the Baltimore Orioles, who were the scourge of the league, and they were filled with fighting Irishmen, and John McGraw was their leader. So then he became the New York Giants coach, and instilled that same sort of pugnacious, we're going to fight you all the way and never give up type of attitude, which was all fine. McGraw signed and saw promise in a pitcher called Christy Mathewson. And in fact, in the 1905 World Series, Christy Mathewson pitched 3 times, 3 shutouts, and won all 3 games. And New York Giants won the first World Series. So, or not the first, but the 3rd World Series. At any rate, so things were very fresh. And when the Cubs rolled in on their Eastern tour, probably on a train from Pittsburgh into New York, the pitch was fever high on what's going to happen. The 2 teams were, I think the Giants were 1 game ahead of the Pirates and Cubs, who were tied in 2nd place. So every game was your World Series. The pressure was intense. The games were great, well attended, well reported. And so, as a background going into this game, and it's New York. It's New York. So everything is intensified. New York against Chicago, Chicago, the second city. Of course, I learned a little trivia with your, Ian, that the second city name did not come because the Chicago was a little bit lesser than New York. No, that came because that was the nickname put after the Chicago fire on the new city that was built.
That's right. That was the second city after O'Leary's cow kicked the canister with the oil lamp on it and burned down good old Chicago.
And then here in Wisconsin, we recall that on the very same day of the Chicago fire, there was an even worse fire in northern Wisconsin and upper Michigan called the Peshtigo fire, which destroyed, we talk about our fires in California right now. This fire destroyed hundreds of thousands of acres and killed, I think, about 1,500 people that were living there. It was terrible.
Oh.
And that was the same day as the Chicago fire. It was very dry in the Midwest, and that's the way that went down. So here we are. It's 1908. Johnny Evers, being alert, is talking with the umpires and making even. And I think Mike Cameron suggested that even before the game, when the managers would go out and talk about the ground rules, because this was so fresh, this was a rule that had never been enforced in a game. This was a technical violation, if you will, or perceived that way. And to make sure everybody was aware of it, Evers talked about it potentially even before games were played. Hey, if this situation comes up, what's the call? The call is you have to enforce Rule 59, and even if the runner scores, touches home plate before that last force out is made, then run doesn't score. So here we are. It's middle of September. It's about 10 games to go in the season, 15 maybe. Cubs have a series against the Giants in New York. The game is a hard-fought game. Merkle ends up being the starter at first base because of the other veteran who had started the 47 previous games couldn't play, and he was in the lineup, a rookie. But it's one of those stories that Mike Cameron sets out is really just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. We'll go through why that is.
Now let's set the stage for there. We know it's coming to the end of September. Now again, the Cubs going on 3 years in a row. This is a powerhouse team. Let's talk about the pitching stuff. We have Mordecai Brown on the team. We got something that looked like the Atlanta Braves in the 1990s.
Right. Well, Mordecai Brown was a very interesting player. They called him Three-Fingered Brown, and that's because he had damaged his pitching hand as a youth in a farm accident. And he had, I think he lost a finger, and two of his three fingers were disformed. But it, oddly enough, gave him a way of gripping a baseball that no other player could grip it. And he was a big, strapping guy to begin with. And so his curveball was like Bruce Sutter. I always thought Bruce Sutter threw the most unhittable pitch with his split-fingered fastball when he pitched for the Cubs and then later for the Cardinals and made it through the Hall of Fame. And the ball just dropped off the table. So Mordecai Brown, and he was an established pitcher. They also had a pitcher by the name of Jack Feister, who I think was a fastball pitcher, but he earned the nickname as the Giant Killer because every time he'd pitch against the Giants, he seemingly would win. There's a few other pitchers that have gone down as Yankee Killers. At any rate, that was Jack Feister or Pfister. They also had I think a pitcher by the name of Ed Rulbach, who was their three-starter and was just a very steady, good pitch, solid pitcher. So the Cubs were loaded. I think your analogy to the Braves of the 90s is very apt. But also, look at Pittsburgh Pirates. Honus Wagner in his prime playing shortstop. They were great. The Giants, Christy Mathewson, Hall of Fame pitcher. He was great. And the rest of the players. So you really had a type of thing that the cream had risen to the top. And what these players were doing on the field was art as well as sport.
And it's so interesting because, like you mentioned before, look, there's no basketball, there's no football, but there is boxing. And there is baseball.
Boxing and there's horse racing. Those are the three sports.
And all three.
Only three.
Yeah, and only of these three sports, the gamblers got in charge of it. So, in every sport, they did. Well, I wrote my book on the gambling, but let's set up for the incident here, which Merkle becomes well famous for. You tell the story of how it happened and what went down afterwards.
Okay, so the game in the Polo Grounds, it's tied 2-2. Now there's 20,000 fans, total packed house for the game in the Polo Grounds. It's tied 2-2, so it's been a very exciting game all the way through. The fans are on the edge of their seats, waiting to see what's going to happen, and the Giants are one game ahead in the World Series race, or the race for the pennant. The ninth inning, Cubs don't score. Still 2-2. It goes into the bottom of the ninth. Now, we also have to remember and keep it in mind a little bit that, were there lights on the field in those days? No, this is 1908. All games are played during the day. So now by the end of a long game like this, the sun is starting to get a little lower in the western skies. The Giants get up, and they put runners on first and third with 2 outs. The score is tied. Merkle, actually, he comes up with 2 outs and a runner on first base, and he lines a base hit to the outfield, and the runner goes to third. Now, he's technically probably the hero of the game for that hit. He's on first base. The next hitter drills a base hit to center field. The runner lopes in from third base with the winning run. Merkle, and at that moment, the fans, some of whom are already on the field and been drinking all day and gambling all day and enjoying a great day outside, they storm the field. Merkle does what every other major league player did at the time, and minor league player, what every player did at the time. It's a gentleman's game. There's no question. A base hit, the runner scored, making the score 3-2. The game is over. As he's going towards second base, to avoid the fans, he veers off and never goes all the way to second base. Of course, Johnny Evers, the second baseman of the Cubs, sees this, and he seizes on it. We've been talking about this. This is the moment. And he goes over and stands on second base and yells at the Cub players, "Get me that ball." And the Cub players are all in on it, too. Get me that ball. So the ball comes in from center field into the infield. The third base coach for the New York Giants, he knows something's wrong. And if Johnny Evers wants that ball at second base, I don't want him to have it. So the third base coach for the Giants runs into the infield, picks up the ball, and throws it into the stands. Evers then yells at his team and says, "Get me that ball." And 2 rookie Cub players vault the fence, go into the stands, and finds the fan who's got the ball. Now, being a New York fan, what does he do? Does he say, "Oh, sure, here's the ball"? No, he says, "I got this ball. This is my ball. You can't have my ball." That's it. Do you think that stops the Cub rookie players? No. They hit the guy in the face and pummel him and beat him up until he coughs up the ball. and they throw the ball back in, and they get it over to Johnny Evers on second base. Now the sun is really setting, and it's chaos on the field. Fans are running all over this way, hither and yon, but the umpire is still on the field, Hank O'Day, the same umpire that was the umpire in Pittsburgh. There was also at this game a base umpire whose name I can't come up with at the moment. So Johnny Evers, so it was the second base umpire's call, the other umpire's call. And Johnny Evers yells at the umpire, and when he's got the ball, he's standing on second base. He said, the runner didn't go all the way to second base. This is a force out. He's out. Call it. And the second base umpire says, I didn't see it. Then, under baseball rule, the call reverted to the home plate umpire.
Which now is O'Day.
Hank O'Day says, I saw it. Merkle did not go all the way to second base. Therefore, the force at second is good. The runner is out. I'm applying Rule 59. The run does not score, even though that runner touched home plate before the force out was made. And because there's all these players in this chaos on the field, I'm calling the game. There's no extra innings, and I'm calling it a tie. Well, in a tie game, then, that would mean that you'd play another game to determine the winner of this game. You wouldn't pick it up at that time, but in those days, and I think still today too, you start over with another full game. And so that's the call on the field. No game, and John McGraw and the New York Giants were livid, and they stormed the field. You can't do this to us. You're stealing this game for us. You know this could be the pennant. But O'Day holds firm. He says, no, that's my call. I'm sticking to it. And so it was a tie. Well, that was appealed then to the league office. Now, in these days, too, there was no commissioner of baseball. It would go to the president of the National League, and these were marketing people. They were not jurists or anything else. They didn't know what to do. So essentially, they took the stories from both sides originally, and they still didn't know what to do. So what they decided to do was punt, in essence. And they said, okay, this is so serious that the call, we have to back our umpires, so the call of the umpire stands for now, and we're going to allow the Giants 5 games. There's 15 games left in the season. We're going to allow them a time period of 5 games to submit evidence to us why the call should be changed. And then once they do that, we're going to give the Cubs another 5 days, 5 games to respond. And then we're going to add another 5 games to make our decision. And we'll make our decision by the end of the 5th game being played, which took the decision to the end of the season. The hope was, of course, that in the next 15 games, the true champion would become clear, and there'd be no need to discuss what happened in this game that was called a tie. Well, guess what? Didn't happen that way. And the Pirates fell off, but the Cubs and the Giants finished in a statistical tie for first place. Well, now that third set of 55 games is over, a decision's got to be made. Well, what to do. And they took more evidence from the Giants. I had always found it interesting as a lawyer, Ian, and I think you do too, would too. The idea is that one of the contentions of the Giants was that Merkle went all the way to second base and touched second base.
That's right. That was one of the accounts.
And in fact, 8 players submitted sworn affidavits that they saw Merkle touch second base. Can you imagine a citizen lying on an affidavit? We had 8 of them. So that contention didn't fly, despite the sworn affidavits. Finally, they said, well, in essence, and I think this appeal went way into the night, what to do, and they finally came out, we have to support our umpire, otherwise our umpires are going to quit on us. And they're the force of integrity, really, in the game itself, is the umpiring crew, especially with all the gambling you're talking about that went on and so on. So the league office then said, okay, we're going to consider that game a tie. We're going to consider the pennant race a tie, which means there's a one-game playoff. Well, of course, what do you think McGraw and the Giants said? We're not playing it. We already won that game. You can't take that pennant from us. But the league office said, well, I'm sorry, Mr. McGraw, if you do that, then we're going to call the one-game playoff in favor of the Cubs because you didn't show up to play it. Well, okay. So now they scheduled the game, and the game was on. Now this, then, and all the meantime in the newspapers, in the tabloids, all the New York papers, they looked at this and they said they pinned the scapegoat on Merkle. He did everything that every other player would do at the time. So he really isn't culpable at all. But they pinned on him the name Bonehead Merkle for making a bonehead play, not going all the way to second base.
And you know what's fascinating, JD? Let me tell you this. McGraw never chastised Merkle for it. He defended him.
He played for another 18 years for John McGraw in the major leagues.
That's right.
He was told to be an outstanding bridge player and great teammate and excellent player. So that's the biggest testimony to the guy's ability. He's no bonehead for sure.
And you know what? He fell on hard times during the Depression, but then he became successful in a fishing bait business, and went on, and he was bitter for a long time of baseball, but he was able to come back to the reunion.
Yes, right. But the true baseball fans knew that he had been falsely accused. So this playoff game, though, was really something, and I think Mike Cameron writes about it beautifully. He says you can't imagine the stress on it. There were death threats to Johnny Evers and his mother.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Five death threats. Gamblers tried to bribe the umpire who was going to umpire the game. I always get a kick out of, now here we're 1908. I mean, this is well before the age of radio, let alone TV and other media like we have today. That the game was so interesting that in Chicago, on State Street in Madison, 5,000 people gathered while the game was being played, and that Morse code ticker tape would go to Chicago and say, "Oh, this player the count's now 3-2. Oh, he walks and goes to first place," and they put up a big billboard where they would take they had a diamond on the billboard, and then a player would take someone would take a marker and put it to first base, and the 5,000 people would cheer. We have a runner on first. It's amazing that that little a stimulation would bring that kind of a response. 5,000 people standing watching a guy put a player on a billboard. And then in New York, of course, it was pandemonium. The 20,000 seat stadium They specially rigged up to put 30,000 in, but that wasn't big enough. Fans like Woodstock tore the fences and broke into the game. They figure 40,000 people were actually present for the game, this one playoff game. And the story that also got me was, this was when the skyscrapers were going up. We all know that photograph of the famous skyscraper photograph where the guys are eating their lunch and they're so far above the ground. Well, there was that going on, and so there was a whole group of people that were sitting on one of those I-beams 50 feet above the outfield wall looking at the game, and one of them got so excited he fell off 50 feet to his death.
Yeah, and it's and it's.
But then more than that, Ian, another person took his place on the bar.
Yeah.
After watching somebody just fall to their death. Now,
That's right. I mean, all these deja vus and little caveats. It just adds to telling a good story.
This kind of intensity. It's just we think that it's intense when Boston plays the Yankees. But
with the Dodgers and Giants, it gets really heated. If you ask anyone on the West Coast, they'll vouch that the Dodgers and the Giants got more of a hatred than the Yankees and Red Sox. And
sometimes Cub-Cardinal games are that way too.
Oh yeah, then it's unbelievable with the Midwest and stuff. Even the Mets and Phillies, they get pretty heated too. They're pretty bad also. JD was
wait a minute, I have to say from Milwaukee, I think our blood rival is also the Cardinals.
Yeah.
He does from the World Series in '82, and we've never forgotten.
That's right, and that was a great World Series. I actually remember watching that. You had Raleigh Fingers there, and you had
Well, see, that was the thing. He got hurt, and he couldn't pitch at the end. And a lot of people say if he could have been our reliever at the end, we'd have won it. But,
he probably was, because again, he was getting on in years. He was like 35 years old, I think, at the time.
He may have been most valuable player, if not that year, the year before, relief pitcher and most valuable player. But they were great. They were great teams. Harvey's Wallbangers, they called them, with Robin Yount, Paul Molitor, and Cecil Cooper was excellent first baseman.
Ben Ogilvie, I think, was on your team.
Yep. And I think the Brewers are also going to be good this year. They were kind of coming back last year, and they've got good aggressive management and a lot of nice young players. So.
Hey, and the Brewers came into being 4 years after the Braves left, in 1970, the year I was born.
Right.
And I think the way it went was the Seattle Pilots were opened up in '69, but then they moved to Milwaukee because they weren't getting the love out there.
We can talk about that in the Ten Commandments of Baseball, because Bud Selig tells that story very, very well, that he had formulated after the Braves moved, he formulated a corporate structure and had people behind him to try and lure another team. And for a while they thought it might have been the White Sox, and they played exhibition games here that were well attended. But then I think the story there was that the owner of the White Sox, his brother went to him and said, "You can't sell the team to Milwaukee." And so they kept the White Sox in Chicago. And then with the Mariners, the Seattle team, they went bankrupt. I mean, they had a decrepit stadium that they played in. They hired, it was a bad situation. The team wasn't any good because they weren't stocked with players that were, able to really compete. And so fans didn't go out to the park. And the Bud Selig's group had the highest offer to buy the team in the bankruptcy proceedings. And then it happened so quickly that it was right at the end of spring training and the beginning of the new season. But we had a stadium ready to go, the same stadium, the county stadium where the Braves had played. They were kind of ready. And so what happened was that, if you can imagine this, the team bus carrying all the equipment and many of the players that were heading Seattle to open the season all of a sudden had to change course and go to Milwaukee.
Milwaukee, that's right. And you know what's interesting, JD? A lot of people who live in the Milwaukee area always tell me, because I have all my Facebook sites, they always say they like County Stadium better than Miller Park because it was sunny, and with Miller Park, the shades are just too shady. It makes it very, very dark. What's your opinion of that?
Well, there's attributes to both stadiums, and I like Miller Park. I would take exception to that. It is true that on day games, especially if they start for TV at 3 o'clock, the shadows are somewhat problematic, even if the roof is open, because of the way the stadium's built. But that usually passes after a couple innings, and I don't see it as it's just too bad that that's the way it worked out, because it's sure nice in springtime and late fall sometimes to have that roof closed and you're sitting comfortably in a the way the heating goes is that it can carry the outside temperature. It can only increase it, I think, 22 degrees. So you might have 40 degrees outside, but it's 62 degrees, and then you wear a sweater and a coat, and all the games are played. That's another great thing, is that if somebody's having maybe have a tour bus that's traveling 250 miles, you know that game is going to be played.
That's right. Hey, it's been nice having you on the show. Hang on the line, and I'll end the show, and then I'll give you a little chat afterwards, like I always do. All my listeners know how I end it. Folks, it was great having JD on today. Go out, get JD Thorn's book, The 10 Commandments of Baseball, an affectionate look at Joe McCarthy's 10 rules that even we follow today. Also, go out and get Public Bonehead, Private Hero, The Real Legacy of Baseball's Fred Merkle by Mike Cameron. This winter, holidays are coming. Get yourself the gift of reading. Keep yourself warm during the winter until spring training. As for me, the first season ends with Mr. Thorn right here. We had a great time, and as always, we end with.
Before you end, Ian, can I just add one thing? None of this would be possible without the publisher, Larry Norris of Sporting Chance Press. So if you want to buy the books, go to his website, sportingchancepress.com, and they're $20 a piece.
That's fantastic to know. And I spoke to Larry. He was kind enough to send me these books, and it's a great book publishing. They got a few books out there, folks. Go to the website, get the books. As always, in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.
Thank you.